All right, let's start because we're there.
We're there.
We're basically there. All right, hello everyone. I'm Cody Rue. This is the Church of Logic. I'm joined once again by Phil Zucker. I'm very excited to have him here because it's always funner to do these things with him, and I'm also excited about what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about ordinal analysis and how one can use ordinals to gain an understanding about how powerful logical knowledge is, right? Understand what it means to be consistent and why a certain system is consistent. Really understand why this form of reasoning should be trusted. And that's basically a whole philosophical deal with metamathematics, right? It's let's understand why these principles of reasoning are sound and whether we can ever find, a contradiction using our normal intuitive sense of reasoning. The incompleteness theorem is basically, a way to say it's hopeless, right? The incompleteness theorem says you're not going to be able to prove consistency of a given logical system in itself, right? If it contains enough arithmetic, it's hopeless. You can't possibly prove that you're never going to get a contradiction. So maybe somewhere in there's horrible contradiction that completely destroys our intuition about what it means to be true and what it means to be consistent. But despite this very deep obstruction, people have tried anyway to give justifying principles to various forms of logic. And those justifying principles they have to be somehow an appeal to intuition. But I find it informative to see how those appeals to intuition take form, really. Like how are we really trying to convince you, and what mechanism are we trying to convince you? So ordinal analysis does this by saying, hey, there is a way to look at a combinatorial object called an ordinal. And I've talked about ordinals before. And if you believe that combinatorial object correctly encodes an ordinal, that is, there are no infinite decreasing sequences of those ordinals, then there's some simple in some sense, way to turn that intuition, that understanding, into, the intuition or the understanding that the logical system is consistent. So I'm going to try and sort of tug apart this idea and talk with Phil, who I think is less familiar with the details. Mm-hmm. And if we're lucky and have the time, we can actually go into a very detailed unwinding of this idea for pure first order logic, where you can really take an ordinal and then unpack that connection between the ordinal, the termination of a certain lambda calculus, and the consistency of a certain logic, which is first order logic. So we're gonna try and do that, but we're gonna try and motivate it a little bit first. So what's an ordinal, right? What do you understand to be an ordinal?
Well, yeah, all right. So what's my basic? You said it was combinatorial, which is not what I would have said, because combinatorial to me means like, a finite number of things, and I'm like plugging them together. I'm counting, I don't know, number of ways of playing cards come down or something. Yeah. But like an ordinal, kind of the cool thing that happened is that it's an infinite. It's a way of talking about infinities. One of the possible ways of talking about infinity. That's an extension of the natural numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And then they actually complete it with the notion of omega, like the first, infinite ordinal. And then you can, once you're at the infinite step, you can go infinity plus 1, infinity plus 2, infinity plus 3. And there is a systematic way, a rigorous way of going about this. And what we've just said is actually very informal and is, like in the actual ordinal system, 1 plus omega is not the same thing as omega plus 1. So, there is like a rigorous subtlety here that is kind of hard to get across in the podcast.
That's true, though. Maybe we can try and get that one unwound, right?
Yeah.
What matters is how do you go down, right? What does it mean to go down an ordinal, right? And for addition, ordinals can be seen as, steps on some infinite ladder, right? And so omega is steps that go up forever, right? But if you hit an individual step, then you're at some finite level, and you can only go down a finite number of times. And it's pretty intuitive that if you add a step to the bottom of that ladder, it doesn't really change anything, right? You might have to take another single step. But those two stairs, those two infinite staircases that kind of go off into the void, they look the same, right? Whether there's an extra step at the bottom or not. But if you add a step to the top above every other step, then that is actually different, right? You're standing on that top step, or you're not. You're somewhere in the infinite steps underneath. Mm-hmm. And so the first one of those ordinals is 1 plus omega, right? And that is omega because it's just the same shape. Whereas the other one is omega plus 1, and that is definitely different. There's that top step at the very top, and then if you step down, you're going to be somewhere in that finite level. And then you're going to be able to keep going down. In particular, if two people, if one person was on the omega plus 1 step and the other person was on the 1 plus omega step, and they were having a contest of who can take the most number of steps down, right? The 1 plus omega person is somewhere in the middle there. He knows, or she knows, how many steps they can go down, at the most, just because they see a finite number of steps between them. But the omega plus 1 person can just pick a step that's higher, right? So they can beat, in terms of the number of steps they go down, they can beat the other one. And so that notion of being able to beat the other one, it means that omega plus 1 is strictly bigger than 1 plus omega. All right. So this notion of being able to go down steps, that really is the crucial notion of ordinals. And there's nothing intrinsically infinitary about these, I think. For the kind of, I don't know, obvious reason, maybe? I hesitate to say obvious. But basically, you can encode these things on a computer. Mm-hmm. So how would you encode, say, omega plus omega on a computer?
So it turns out that there are systems of describing some of the ordinals. Like, the ordinals go way, way up. I don't even know how to describe how far they go up, because you lose language to even talk about how far they could go up, or it stops making sense how far they're going up, because you're playing with crazy infinities. Anyway, you can download Python packages, for example. There is a Python package that has ordinal numbers in it, and you can actually say take this one and add it to this other one, or you can take this one and multiply it by this other one. You can exponentiate them. And there's an algorithm for taking the representations, which are these tree representations, sort of syntax trees, kind of. They're more closely how you'd store a polynomial in a computer. So an ordinary polynomial of 1 plus 2x plus 78 x squared plus 42 x cubed, right? Really, you could describe that as maybe a list of numbers, 1, 2, 42, 78. Or you could have it as a dictionary that maps the exponents to the coefficient they have in them. And likewise, there are systems, and not a unique system, but they're very interesting different systems you can have for describing ordinal numbers using ordinary tree data types or dictionary data types and tuple data types and stuff. And there's algorithms for actually computing, if you give me the representation of omega and the representation of omega plus 2, and you ask me to add them, it will give you back omega 2 plus 2, I think is right. And, it will be something that has that 2, as it stores an integer, and that other 2 stores an integer in a tree in some particular way.
Right. I was blanking for a second because there's a name for these things, and they're called ordinal notations. Mm-hmm. there's kind of this general notion that kind of encompasses all possible ordinal notations, but it's kind of a useless concept in the sense that it's too powerful. It just sort of says, hey, anything that you could possibly imagine as a computer representation of an ordinal should be contained in this notion. But it's useful for mathematicians because then they can say, okay, well, the thing we're going to talk about, the relationship between these logical systems, these ordinals, only makes sense if you have some ordinal notation. And then, maybe we're going to elide some of the details about this notation and not care too much, as long as you believe us that there's a reasonable ordinal notation. And this general notion is just, an ordinal is some computer program that either that decides whether you are either 0 or something called a successor ordinal, so some ordinal plus 1, right? And then it returns the predecessor, or something called a limit ordinal, which takes in an int, right, like a positive integer, and returns an ordinal that is less than the ordinal you're describing, right? But as you go up in the ends, n plus 1, n plus 2, n plus 3, those ordinals need to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And at the limit, if you take the union of all these ordinals, that is the ordinal you're representing, right? So omega is the limit of, n plus 1, n plus 2, n plus 3. And omega plus omega is the limit of, 1, 2, 3, 4, omega plus 1, omega plus 2, omega plus 3, omega plus 4, etc. Right? And different notations can be equivalent, right? They can represent the same ordinal. But in general, that doesn't really matter that much, right? As long as you have two reasonable notations, then whatever you do is going to kind of be agnostic to these representations, right? So what it means for an ordinal to have a notation basically means that that ordinal can be talked about in a finite way, right? And talking about things in a finite way is basically the only way we can assign meaning, right? Some meaningful philosophical, ontology to an object is that we can manipulate it in a finite way, right? That things that are intrinsically infinite, that we can't write down or even really describe, that's more iffy, right? Do those things exist? What does it even mean to say they exist, right?
Yeah.
Can we think about them? I don't know. So we need some representation for.
But do you need an effective representation? I mean, we're getting to parts where I don't know because if I give you just some data structure representing ordinal 1 and some data structure representing ordinal 2, A and B, let's say A and B, are they equal? Can you actually compute the addition of them? Is there actually an algorithm to do that? How do you actually do that? If you just say, oh, this symbol smiley face represents some ordinal that is crazy, right, and then I don't know how to manipulate it at all or ask any questions of it, that's not useful, and maybe that's meaningless or something.
Right. I'm not going to answer that question, but I'm going to move the conversation a little bit. All right, I'm going to take just one beat